The year is 1880. The United States stands at a crossroads between tradition and transformation. The vast frontier territories, once wild and untamed, now find themselves under the watchful eye of expanding governmental authority. In this era of change, when the old ways clash with new systems of control, ordinary individuals are forced to make extraordinary choices. This is the story of Edward Kelly, a man whose name would become synonymous with resistance against institutional oppression. His journey from common citizen to legendary figure represents more than just one man's struggle. It embodies the broader conflict between individual liberty and centralized power that defined the American experience in the late 19th century. To understand Edward Kelly, we must first understand the world that shaped him. The 1880s were a time of profound transformation across North America. The Civil War's conclusion 15 years prior had reshaped the nation's political landscape, yet many questions about justice, equality, and the proper role of authority remained unresolved. While the conflict had ended, its social and economic consequences continued to reverberate through every level of society. The frontier regions of the United States in 1880 represented a unique intersection of possibility and challenge. These territories attracted individuals from diverse backgrounds, farmers seeking fertile land, merchants pursuing commercial opportunities, former soldiers looking for fresh starts, and countless others hoping to build better lives far from the established order of the eastern states. However, the frontier was far from the lawless wilderness often depicted in popular imagination. By 1880, formal governmental structures had extended into most Western territories. Federal marshals, territorial courts, and local law enforcement agencies worked to establish order according to legal frameworks developed far from the communities they served. This distance between lawmaking and law living created tension that would define the era. The economic structure of frontier communities reflected both opportunity and inequality. Land ownership patterns, access to resources, and relationships with governmental authorities varied dramatically, based on factors including social class, ethnic background, and previous connections to established power structures. Those with capital and influential connections often secured the most valuable properties and commercial licenses, while recent arrivals and marginalized groups found themselves relegated to less desirable circumstances. Transportation networks expanded rapidly during this period. Railroad construction connected previously isolated communities to national markets and governmental centers. While this connectivity brought economic opportunities, it also facilitated the projection of centralized authority into regions that had previously enjoyed considerable autonomy. The iron rails that carried commerce also carried enforcement of regulations created by distant legislatures. Although the United States had achieved independence from British rule over a century earlier, the cultural and administrative patterns established during the colonial period continued to influence American institutions. The hierarchical structures, legal traditions, and attitudes toward authority that characterized British imperial administration found echoes in how governmental power operated in 19th century America. The term crown in Edward Kelly's story serves as both literal reference to British colonial influence still present in North American affairs and metaphorical representation of any distant, unaccountable authority that claimed power over local communities. In 1880, Victoria's reign as British monarch was at its height, and British imperial attitudes toward governance, emphasizing control, order, and deference to established authority, influenced administrative thinking across the English-speaking world. Several factors contributed to this ongoing influence. Many American governmental officials, particularly in positions of authority, came from backgrounds that valued British legal and administrative traditions. Educational institutions that trained lawyers, judges, and administrators often emphasized British common law and constitutional principles. Commercial relationships between American enterprises and British financial interests created networks through which cultural attitudes flowed alongside capital. For marginalized communities, including recent immigrants, indigenous peoples, religious minorities, and the economically disadvantaged, these imperial attitudes meant their concerns were often dismissed or subordinated to maintaining order, as defined by those in authority. The presumption that officials knew better than ordinary citizens what was best for communities created resentment that simmered beneath the surface of frontier society. Edward Kelly's origins remain somewhat obscure, as was common for many frontier figures whose lives became legendary. Historical records suggest he was born in the late 1840s or early 1850s, placing him in his late 20s or early 30s by 1880. His exact birthplace is debated among historians, with various accounts suggesting different locations across the Midwestern and Western territories. What we know with greater certainty is that Kelly's formative years coincided with some of the most turbulent periods in American history. Whether he personally participated in the Civil War or was too young to serve, the conflict's impact shaped his generation's worldview. The war had promised to resolve fundamental questions about freedom and equality, yet the reality of Reconstruction and its aftermath left many of those questions unanswered. Kelly's education was likely informal, typical of frontier communities where formal schooling was limited. However, contemporary accounts describe him as articulate and well-read, suggesting he pursued self-education through whatever books and newspapers reached his community. This autodidactic approach was common among ambitious individuals on the frontier, where institutional education was scarce, but curiosity and determination could compensate. His early occupations remain a matter of historical speculation. Various sources suggest he worked as a ranch hand, freight hauler, or independent tradesman, occupations that would have brought him into contact with diverse segments of frontier society. These experiences would have provided him with first-hand knowledge of how different groups fared under prevailing governmental and economic systems. Several biographical accounts mention Kelly's reputation for fairness in his dealings with others. Even before his later prominence, neighbors apparently regarded him as someone who could be trusted to keep his word and who showed respect to individuals regardless of their social standing. This reputation for integrity would become crucial to his later role as a voice for the marginalized. To understand Kelly's eventual rebellion, we must examine the specific conditions that characterized frontier governance in the 1880s. While American democracy promised equality before the law and government accountability to citizens, the reality in many frontier communities diverged significantly from this ideal. Local governmental authority frequently concentrated in the hands of small groups who maintained their positions through combinations of electoral manipulation, economic pressure, and strategic alliances with territorial and federal officials. In communities where most residents lived at subsistence level, those who controlled access to land, credit, and commercial opportunities could exert tremendous influence over political processes. Corruption took various forms. Officials might accept payments to overlook regulatory violations, grant licenses to preferred applicants regardless of qualifications, or use their positions to advance personal business interests. Law enforcement could be selective, rigorously pursuing minor infractions by the powerless, while ignoring substantial misconduct by the well-connected. Court proceedings might favor those who could afford skilled legal representation while providing minimal justice to those without such resources. The distance between frontier communities and higher levels of government complicated accountability. Territorial governors and federal officials might be hundreds of miles away, receiving information about local conditions primarily through the reports of the very officials whose conduct needed oversight. Traveling to territorial capitals or federal offices to lodge complaints was beyond the means of most ordinary citizens, who could not afford the time away from their work or the expenses of extended travel. Communication challenges further isolated frontier communities. News from governmental centers arrived slowly, often filtered through newspapers that reflected the perspectives of their publishers. Citizens might learn of new regulations or policy changes only after they had been in effect for weeks or months. This information gap placed ordinary people at a disadvantage when dealing with officials who had faster access to legal and administrative developments. The frontier population was remarkably diverse, but this diversity did not translate into equal treatment or opportunity. Understanding the specific challenges faced by marginalized groups is essential to comprehending why Kelly's later advocacy would resonate so powerfully. Recent immigrants represented a significant portion of frontier communities. Individuals and families from Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, China, Mexico, and numerous other countries sought opportunities in Western territories. Many arrived with limited English language skills and little understanding of American legal and governmental systems. This made them vulnerable to exploitation by employers, merchants, and officials who could take advantage of their unfamiliarity with their rights. Language barriers created particular challenges. Official documents, legal proceedings, and governmental communications were conducted in English, placing non-English speakers at severe disadvantage. Misunderstandings about contracts, property boundaries, and regulatory requirements could result in serious consequences. Some unscrupulous individuals deliberately exploited these language barriers to defraud immigrants of their property or wages. Indigenous peoples faced their own distinct challenges. Federal policies regarding Native American tribes in the 1880s emphasized assimilation and the breaking up of tribal lands into individual allotments. These policies, imposed without meaningful consultation with affected communities, disrupted traditional ways of life, while often failing to provide promised support for transition to new economic arrangements. Indigenous peoples who attempted to maintain traditional practices or resist imposed changes frequently found themselves in conflict with governmental authorities. Economic marginalization affected many frontier residents regardless of ethnic background. Sharecroppers, tenant farmers, wage laborers, and small independent operators often found themselves in perpetual debt to merchants, landowners, or company stores. Credit systems that charged exorbitant interest rates kept families in cycles of obligation. When crop failures or economic downturns occurred, those without financial reserves faced potential loss of everything they had worked to build. Women in frontier communities confronted legal and social restrictions that limited their autonomy. Property laws in many jurisdictions restricted married women's ability to own land or conduct business independently. While frontier necessity sometimes created opportunities for women to exercise initiative and leadership, formal authority structures remained predominantly male. Widows and single women faced particular challenges in asserting their rights within legal and commercial systems designed around male participation. Edward Kelly's transformation from ordinary citizen to advocate for the marginalized did not occur suddenly. Rather, it represented the culmination of accumulated experiences and observations that gradually revealed the systematic nature of injustice in his community. Several documented incidents appear to have been particularly formative. One account describes Kelly witnessing a dispute between a recent immigrant farmer and a land agent over property boundaries. The farmer insisted his deed covered specific acreage, but the agent claimed different boundaries based on a survey the farmer had never seen. Without funds to hire legal representation and unable to read the complex English legal terminology in his documents, the farmer faced potential loss of a significant portion of his property. Kelly reportedly assisted the farmer in finding someone who could translate the documents and explain the legal situation, helping the farmer understand his options. Another formative experience involved Kelly observing how regulatory enforcement operated selectively. Small operators faced strict application of licensing requirements and operational regulations, while larger enterprises with connections to officials received more flexible treatment. When Kelly questioned this discrepancy, officials provided bureaucratic explanations that amounted to, "That's how things are done." This response, suggesting that unequal treatment was simply standard procedure, appears to have crystallized Kelly's understanding that the problem was not just individual corrupt officials, but systematic practices embedded in how authority operated. Kelly also witnessed how judicial processes functioned differently, depending on who stood accused. When individuals from marginalized communities faced charges, proceedings moved swiftly with minimal consideration of mitigating circumstances or alternative interpretations of events. When prominent citizens faced similar accusations, investigations proceeded slowly. Evidence requirements became more stringent, and outcomes often involved minimal consequences. This pattern repeated across various cases, making clear that justice was not truly blind to social status. These observations led Kelly to a crucial realization. The problems facing marginalized communities were not random misfortunes or isolated incidents of misconduct by particular individuals. Instead, they reflected systematic patterns in how authority operated, patterns that consistently advantaged those who already held power and resources while disadvantaging those without such advantages. This understanding marked Kelly's transition from concerned observer to potential activist. Recognizing systematic injustice meant understanding that addressing individual cases of misconduct would not create lasting change. Real improvement required challenging the structures and practices that made such misconduct routine. Kelly's first efforts to address injustice focused on community education and mutual support. He began organizing informal gatherings where community members could share information about their rights, discuss common problems, and consider collective responses to challenges. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided opportunities for individuals facing similar difficulties to realize they were not alone, that their struggles reflected broader patterns rather than personal failures. This realization was psychologically important, as it countered the isolation that made people feel powerless. Knowing that others shared your concerns and supported your right to fair treatment provided emotional strength to persist in seeking justice. The gatherings also facilitated practical information sharing. More knowledgeable community members could explain legal rights and governmental procedures to those less familiar with such matters. People who had successfully navigated particular challenges could share strategies that might help others in similar situations. This collective knowledge helped level the information advantage that officials and established interests typically enjoyed over marginalized community members. Kelly's role in these gatherings evolved gradually. Initially, he participated as an equal among equals, sharing his observations and learning from others' experiences. Over time, however, his clarity of analysis, effectiveness in articulating common concerns, and commitment to fair treatment for all earned him increasing respect within the community. People began looking to him for guidance and leadership. One of Kelly's key insights was recognizing the importance of documentation. He encouraged community members to keep records of transactions, to request written explanations of official decisions, and to document instances where they believed they had been treated unfairly. This documentation served two purposes. It provided concrete evidence when disputing official actions, and it created an historical record that revealed patterns of systematic misconduct that might not be apparent from individual incidents. Kelly also emphasized the importance of solidarity across different marginalized groups. He understood that officials could more easily dismiss concerns when they came from isolated groups who could be characterized as having particular grievances. However, when diverse groups, immigrants from different countries, native-born laborers, small farmers, independent merchants, united around common principles of fair treatment and accountable authority, their collective voice became harder to ignore. This coalition building was not always easy. Different groups had their own specific concerns, and sometimes harbored prejudices against each other that mirrored broader social divisions. Kelly worked to help people see beyond these divisions to recognize their common interest in systems that treated everyone fairly, according to consistent principles, rather than according to social status or official favoritism. Understanding Edward Kelly's later actions requires examining the philosophical principles that guided his thinking. While Kelly was not a formally trained philosopher or political theorist, his worldview reflected deep engagement with fundamental questions about justice, authority, and human dignity. Central to Kelly's thinking was a belief in inherent human dignity that did not depend on social status, wealth, or official recognition. He rejected the notion that some people were naturally suited to rule, while others were meant to obey. Instead, he maintained that all individuals possessed reason and moral capacity that entitled them to respectful treatment and meaningful participation in decisions affecting their lives. This commitment to universal human dignity led Kelly to question authority that could not justify itself through service to those governed. He distinguished between legitimate authority, which earned respect through competent performance of beneficial functions and accountability to those it served, and mere power, which demanded obedience based solely on position or force. Kelly argued that authority deserved respect only insofar as it fulfilled its obligations to serve justice and the common good. Kelly's understanding of justice emphasized fairness and consistency. He believed that rules should apply equally to all, that similar situations should be treated similarly, and that exceptions required principled justifications rather than simply reflecting whoever had influence with decision-makers. This insistence on principled consistency challenged practices where rules bent to accommodate the powerful, while binding the powerless strictly. Another key element of Kelly's worldview was his understanding of freedom. He recognized that formal legal rights meant little if people lacked practical ability to exercise those rights. True freedom required not just absence of explicit legal restrictions, but also access to resources, information, and social support necessary to make meaningful choices. A person who was technically free, but economically dependent on exploitative arrangements or systematically excluded from opportunities, was not genuinely autonomous. Kelly also understood the relationship between individual and collective action. While he valued individual initiative and personal responsibility, he recognized that many challenges facing marginalized communities could not be addressed through purely individual efforts. Systematic problems required collective responses. However, Kelly maintained that collective action should serve to expand individual freedom rather than subordinate individuals to group demands. These philosophical commitments informed Kelly's approach to addressing injustice. He sought not merely to replace bad officials with better ones, but to establish principles and practices that would make systematic misconduct more difficult, regardless of who held official positions. He worked to empower community members to understand and assert their rights, rather than making them dependent on his personal intervention. He aimed to create conditions where fair treatment was the normal expectation, rather than a fortunate exception. As Kelly's organizing efforts gained prominence, they inevitably attracted attention from those who benefited from existing arrangements. Officials and established interests viewed Kelly's activities with growing concern, seeing in them a challenge to their authority and position. Initial responses were relatively mild. Some officials attempted to dismiss Kelly as a troublemaker or agitator, suggesting that he was stirring up discontent among people who should be satisfied with their situations. These characterizations aimed to undermine Kelly's credibility and isolate him from broader community support. However, this approach proved ineffective because Kelly's analysis resonated with people's lived experiences. When officials claimed everything was fine, community members knew from direct experience that this was not true. As dismissive tactics failed to quiet Kelly's advocacy, responses escalated. Officials began looking for pretexts to take action against him. They scrutinized his business dealings for any potential violations of regulations. They questioned his associates, seeking information that might be used to discredit him. They spread rumors designed to damage his reputation and create suspicion about his motives. These tactics reflected a broader pattern of how authorities responded to challenges from marginalized communities. Rather than addressing the substantive concerns being raised, officials focused on attacking the credibility and character of those raising concerns. This approach aimed to avoid confronting systematic problems by instead making the conversation about whether particular activists were trustworthy. Kelly recognized these tactics for what they were and refused to be distracted by them. He maintained focus on substantive issues of justice and fair treatment, while also being scrupulously careful in his own conduct to avoid providing legitimate grounds for action against him. This discipline was crucial. One significant mistake could have been used to discredit not just Kelly personally, but the broader movement for reform he represented. The tension between Kelly's advocacy and official authority created an unstable situation. Officials wanted to maintain existing arrangements, but faced growing community pressure for change. Kelly and his supporters wanted meaningful reform, but lacked formal power to compel it. Both sides maneuvered for advantage while the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. This escalating tension set the stage for Kelly's decision to create a dramatic symbol of resistance, his famous iron armor. That development, however, belongs to the next chapter of our story. By late 1880, Edward Kelly had emerged as a significant voice for marginalized communities in frontier society. His journey from ordinary citizen to community leader reflected the specific conditions of that time and place, conditions where governmental authority often served the interests of a privileged few rather than the common good, where injustice was systematic rather than incidental, and where ordinary people had limited recourse against mistreatment by officials. Kelly's significance lies not just in his individual story, but in what that story reveals about broader historical forces. The late 19th century American frontier was a place of collision between competing visions of society. One vision emphasized hierarchy, deference to established authority, and acceptance of inequality as natural. Another vision emphasized equality, accountability of authority to those governed, and the possibility of creating fairer social arrangements. Kelly embodied the second vision, his insistence that all people deserve dignified treatment, that authority must justify itself through service rather than demanding blind obedience, and that ordinary people had both right and capacity to shape their collective destiny, challenged fundamental assumptions of those who held power. The stage was now set for the dramatic developments that would make Edward Kelly's name legendary. His experiences had prepared him to take a bold stand. His organizing had built a community ready to support that stand. The injustices he had documented had created undeniable evidence of the need for change, and the intransigence of established authority had made clear that meaningful reform would not come through quiet appeals. What happened next would transform Kelly from community advocate into symbol of resistance, a transformation inseparable from his famous iron armor, which would come to represent the determination of ordinary people to defend their dignity against those who would deny it. The transition from advocacy to action often requires a catalyst, a moment when abstract principles crystallize into concrete symbols that capture public imagination. For Edward Kelly, that catalyst came in the form of an unlikely material, iron. In an age when iron represented industrial progress, railroad expansion, and the machinery of modern civilization, Kelly would transform this commonplace metal into something extraordinary, a symbol of resistance that would resonate far beyond his immediate community. This chapter explores the creation of Kelly's famous armor, examining not just the practical considerations of its construction, but also the profound symbolic meaning it held for those who witnessed it. The armor represented more than personal protection. It embodied the determination of ordinary people to stand firm against institutional power that had proven indifferent to their concerns. Understanding how and why Kelly created his armor requires examining the specific circumstances that made such a dramatic gesture both necessary and meaningful. The story of the armor's creation is inseparable from the broader narrative of resistance against systematic injustice. Kelly's decision to fashion protective equipment reflected his recognition that peaceful advocacy, while morally justified, might not be sufficient to compel change from authorities who had consistently demonstrated unwillingness to address community concerns through normal channels. The armor represented a bridge between principle and pragmatism, a way to maintain commitment to dignity and justice while acknowledging the realities of power dynamics in frontier society. Historical records provide fragmentary accounts of exactly how Kelly conceived the idea for his armor. Some sources suggest he was inspired by historical accounts of medieval knights, whose armor allowed them to withstand confrontation while pursuing what they believed to be righteous causes. Other accounts indicate more practical inspiration, observation of industrial equipment that protected workers from machinery hazards, adapted to the different challenge of protecting an individual from hostile authority. Most likely, Kelly's inspiration drew from multiple sources, combining historical awareness with practical problem-solving to create something uniquely suited to his circumstances. What we know with greater certainty is that Kelly's armor was not a sudden improvisation, but rather the product of careful planning and skilled craftsmanship. Creating effective protective equipment from available materials required both technical knowledge and considerable labor. Kelly likely spent months considering design requirements, gathering materials, and working out construction methods that would produce armor that was both protective and practical enough to wear. This extended development period also gave him time to consider the symbolic dimensions of what he was creating and how it might serve broader purposes beyond personal protection. The armor's creation also reflected Kelly's understanding of public perception and symbolic communication. He recognized that dramatic gestures could convey messages more powerfully than words alone, particularly in communities where many people had limited literacy or where official channels of communication were controlled by those opposed to reform. A man wearing homemade armor made from iron represented ideas about determination, resourcefulness, and willingness to defend principles that resonated with people's experiences and aspirations. The visual impact of the armor communicated Kelly's seriousness and commitment, in ways that speeches or written appeals might not. Before examining the armor's construction in detail, we must understand the immediate circumstances that prompted Kelly's decision to create such extraordinary equipment. By early 1880, the situation in Kelly's community had reached a critical point. Despite months of organized advocacy, petitions, and attempts to work through official channels, authorities had made no meaningful reforms to address documented patterns of unfair treatment. If anything, official responses had become more dismissive and hostile toward those seeking change. Several specific incidents in late 1879 and early 1880 appear to have crystallized Kelly's thinking. Community members who had been particularly vocal in criticizing official conduct found themselves subjected to increased scrutiny of their activities. Business licenses that should have been routine were delayed or denied for technical reasons that seemed pretextual. Property disputes that should have been straightforward were decided in ways that consistently favored those with connections to officials. The message was clear: challenging authority would bring consequences. These developments created a dilemma for Kelly and his supporters. They could abandon their reform efforts and accept that injustice was simply how things would be. They could continue advocacy while accepting that authorities might never respond constructively, or they could find ways to raise the stakes, making it more difficult for officials to simply ignore legitimate grievances. Kelly chose the third path, but he did so thoughtfully, seeking approaches that would dramatize the conflict without abandoning his principles of dignity and justice for all. The decision to create armor reflected Kelly's strategic thinking about how to shift power dynamics in his community's favor. Authorities had advantages in formal power, but they depended on public perception of legitimacy. If Kelly could create a situation where officials' refusal to address grievances became publicly undeniable, where their responses appeared unreasonable to neutral observers, he might be able to generate pressure for reform that had been absent when authorities could quietly dismiss complaints. The armor would serve multiple purposes: practical protection, yes, but also symbolic statement and tactical tool for forcing public attention to issues that officials preferred to ignore. Kelly's planning for the armor also reflected his awareness of risks. Creating and wearing such equipment would inevitably be interpreted as provocative by authorities already hostile to his advocacy. Officials might claim that the armor indicated aggressive intentions, using it as justification for action against Kelly. He had to consider how to construct and present the armor in ways that would emphasize its defensive rather than threatening nature, making clear that it represented determination to defend principles rather than desire for confrontation. The materials for Kelly's armor came from sources readily available in a frontier community. Iron was commonplace, used in tools, wagons, plows, and countless other applications of daily life. Kelly apparently gathered scrap iron from various sources, pieces that were damaged, worn out, or surplus from other projects. This use of scrap materials was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it meant Kelly could acquire materials without unusual purchases that might attract attention. Symbolically, the transformation of discarded materials into protective equipment paralleled the transformation of marginalized people, dismissed and overlooked by those in power, into a movement capable of demanding justice. The construction process required considerable skill. Ironworking was a respected craft in frontier communities, with blacksmiths providing essential services for agriculture, transportation, and construction. Kelly apparently had some ironworking experience, though he may also have received assistance from sympathetic craftsmen who supported his cause. The work involved heating iron pieces to make them malleable, shaping them to fit the contours of the human body, creating attachment points that would hold the pieces together securely, and ensuring that the finished product provided protection while remaining wearable. Contemporary descriptions of Kelly's armor suggest it consisted of several key components. A chest plate protected the torso, the body's most vital area. Additional pieces protected the back, shoulders, and upper arms. The design apparently prioritized protection of essential areas, while leaving enough flexibility for movement. Total coverage would have been impractically heavy and restrictive, so Kelly had to balance protection against mobility. This balance reflected his understanding that the armor's purpose was not to make him invulnerable, but rather to demonstrate determination while providing sufficient protection to withstand confrontation if it occurred. The armor's weight was substantial. Estimates suggest it may have weighed 40 pounds or more. Wearing such equipment required considerable physical strength and endurance. Kelly apparently practiced wearing the armor for extended periods, building up his capacity to bear its weight while remaining mobile. This preparation indicates his serious intention to actually use the armor, rather than creating it merely as symbolic display. He wanted to be ready if circumstances required him to make the dramatic statement that wearing the armor would represent. The appearance of the armor was deliberately imposing. Beyond its functional purpose, Kelly understood that its visual impact would communicate messages to various audiences. For supporters, the armor represented strength, determination, and willingness to defend principles against hostile authority. For officials, it represented a challenge, clear indication that ordinary approaches to intimidating critics would not work with Kelly. For neutral observers, it raised questions about what circumstances would lead a person to take such extraordinary measures, potentially prompting examination of the underlying grievances that motivated Kelly's actions. Kelly's decision about when to first appear publicly in his armor required careful consideration. Timing was crucial. He needed a moment when the armor's symbolic impact would be greatest, and when the context would make clear that it represented response to official intransigence rather than unprovoked aggression. Historical records suggest Kelly waited several months after completing the armor before wearing it publicly, using that time to continue advocacy through conventional means, and to allow the contrast between his reasonable appeals and official dismissiveness to become undeniable to community observers. The first public appearance of Kelly in his armor apparently occurred during a community gathering where grievances were being discussed. Contemporary accounts describe the dramatic impact of Kelly emerging wearing the iron plates, his appearance immediately silencing conversation and drawing all attention. He reportedly spoke briefly, explaining that the armor represented his determination to defend the dignity and rights of all community members, and that he would continue standing for justice regardless of opposition from those who preferred to maintain unjust arrangements. The immediate response to Kelly's armor varied depending on observers' perspectives. Supporters saw it as inspiring demonstration of courage and commitment, the sight of one of their own willing to take such extraordinary measures to defend their collective interests, strengthened their resolve, and made them feel less isolated in their struggles. The armor became a rallying symbol, representing the possibility of standing firm against authority that had seemed overwhelming when faced individually. Officials and their allies viewed the armor with alarm and hostility. They characterized it as threatening, suggesting it indicated Kelly's intention to resist lawful authority. Some claimed the armor demonstrated Kelly's unreasonableness and propensity for dramatic gestures rather than rational discussion. These reactions reflected officials' recognition that Kelly had created something that shifted the dynamics of the conflict in ways that worked against their interests. The armor made it difficult to dismiss Kelly as merely a complainer who could be ignored. It demanded some form of response. Neutral observers, community members who had not been actively involved in either supporting reform efforts or defending existing arrangements, were forced to consider what the armor meant. Why would someone create such equipment unless they felt genuinely threatened? What did it say about official responsiveness that a person felt such measures were necessary? The armor's existence raised questions that made it harder to avoid recognizing the serious nature of conflicts that some had preferred to overlook. The symbolic dimensions of Kelly's armor extended beyond immediate local meanings. In broader historical context, the armor connected to long traditions of individuals standing against powerful institutions in defense of principles. References to knights and their armor invoked ideals of defending the weak and pursuing justice, even at personal cost. The armor's homemade quality, crafted from scrap materials through individual labor, embodied values of self-reliance and resourcefulness that resonated deeply in frontier culture. The armor also represented a reversal of typical power dynamics. Normally, organized authority had advantages in equipment, coordination, and resources that made resistance by ordinary individuals seem futile. Kelly's armor demonstrated that determination and ingenuity could create at least partial countermeasures to some of these advantages. While one person's armor could not eliminate power imbalances, it could reduce them enough to make principled resistance practical. This demonstration that ordinary people could find ways to defend themselves against institutional power had implications far beyond Kelly's immediate situation. The gendered dimensions of the armor also deserve consideration. In 19th-century frontier society, protective equipment and willingness to confront danger were strongly associated with masculine ideals. By creating and wearing armor, Kelly performed a particular kind of masculinity, one connected to protection, courage, and willingness to stand against threats. However, Kelly's version of this masculine ideal was directed not toward conquest or domination, but toward defense of community and principle. This distinction was significant, offering an alternative to masculinity defined by aggression or competitive display of power. The armor's practical effectiveness was secondary to its symbolic power, but it was not irrelevant. Kelly apparently believed the armor would provide meaningful protection if confrontation occurred. Contemporary ironworking techniques could produce equipment capable of deflecting or absorbing impacts that would otherwise cause serious injury. The armor's existence changed the calculation that any potential aggressor had to make. Taking action against Kelly would be more difficult and risky than taking action against an unprotected person. This practical deterrent effect reinforced the armor's symbolic message about determination to resist. The maintenance and care of the armor required ongoing effort. Iron exposed to air and moisture rusts, and the armor's functionality depended on keeping its components in good condition. Kelly apparently treated this maintenance as part of his commitment to the principles the armor represented. Keeping the armor ready for use demonstrated that his gesture was not merely theatrical, but reflected genuine preparedness to act on his convictions. This ongoing relationship with the armor reinforced its role as living symbol rather than static object. The armor's influence extended to how Kelly approached other aspects of his advocacy. Wearing the armor changed how he moved through public spaces and how others interacted with him. The armor's presence in any gathering shifted the emotional tone, adding seriousness and gravity to discussions. Kelly had to adapt his communication style to account for the armor's impact. He could rely less on extended logical arguments, because the armor itself communicated key messages about determination and seriousness. This evolution in Kelly's approach demonstrated his understanding of how material objects and symbolic gestures could complement verbal advocacy. Other community members' responses to the armor revealed divisions and alliances within frontier society. Some who had been neutral or only quietly supportive of reform efforts became more open in their support after seeing Kelly's demonstration of commitment. Others who had been publicly non-committal felt pressured to take positions. The armor's dramatic nature made continued neutrality more difficult to maintain. Officials and their supporters escalated their rhetoric, characterizing Kelly's armor as evidence of dangerous radicalism and calling for action to preserve order. These intensifying responses created momentum toward confrontation that neither side could easily control. Kelly had succeeded in forcing public attention to issues that officials preferred to handle quietly, but this success came at the cost of reducing space for compromise. Officials felt they could not back down without appearing weak, while Kelly could not abandon his stance without betraying the principles and people he represented. The armor had changed the conflict's character, raising stakes for all involved. The period following Kelly's first public appearance in armor saw intensive maneuvering by all parties. Kelly continued his advocacy, now with enhanced visibility and symbolic power. Officials sought ways to respond that would reassert their authority, without making Kelly into a martyr whose treatment would generate broader sympathy. Supporters organized more openly, emboldened by Kelly's example. Opponents consolidated their positions, convinced that firm action against Kelly was necessary to prevent further challenges to established authority. Throughout this period, the armor remained central to how all parties understood the conflict. For Kelly, it represented commitment to principles worth defending. For supporters, it symbolized hope that ordinary people could stand against institutional power. For officials, it represented challenge requiring response. For observers, it raised questions about justice, authority, and the proper relationship between governors and governed. The armor had become more than equipment. It had become the focal point of fundamental debates about how frontier society should be organized and who should have voice in determining its future. The armor also influenced how outside observers viewed the situation. News of Kelly's dramatic gesture spread beyond his immediate community. Through letters, travelers' accounts, and eventually newspaper reports. Some outside observers saw Kelly as a heroic figure defending principles against corrupt local officials. Others viewed him as dangerous troublemaker, whose actions threatened legitimate authority. These competing interpretations reflected broader national debates about authority, justice, and social change in post-Civil War America. Kelly's armor thus participated in conversations extending far beyond its immediate context. The questions it raised about when resistance to authority becomes justified, how ordinary people can effectively challenge institutional power, what relationship should exist between individual liberty and social order, were being debated across American society in the 1880s. Kelly's dramatic gesture provided a concrete example that people could use to think through their positions on these abstract questions. The creation of Edward Kelly's iron armor marked a turning point in his community's struggle for justice, and in Kelly's own journey from advocate to symbol. What began as practical problem-solving, how to protect oneself while standing for principles, became something far more significant. The armor transformed Kelly from community organizer into living representation of resistance against systematic injustice. The armor's power came from combining practical function with symbolic resonance. It was real equipment that provided actual protection, not merely theatrical costume. Yet it also communicated profound messages about determination, resourcefulness, and willingness to defend dignity against those who would deny it. This combination of practical utility and symbolic meaning made the armor effective in ways that either quality alone could not have achieved. Kelly's armor also revealed important truths about power and resistance in frontier society. It demonstrated that ordinary people, working with available resources and their own ingenuity, could create at least partial countermeasures to institutional advantages. It showed that dramatic symbolic gestures could shift public attention and alter power dynamics in ways that conventional advocacy might not, and it proved that material objects, pieces of shaped iron, could carry meanings and generate consequences far beyond their physical properties. The stage was now set for the confrontation that Kelly's armor both symbolized and enabled. Officials could not ignore such dramatic challenge to their authority. Supporters rallied around the powerful symbol Kelly had created. Neutral observers were forced to consider whose cause was just. The armor had changed everything, making continuation of the status quo impossible while making the path forward uncertain and fraught with risk. What happened next would determine whether Kelly's gesture would be remembered as futile defiance or as catalyst for meaningful change. A question that brings us to the next chapter of our narrative. The appearance of Edward Kelly's iron armor transformed abstract debates about justice and authority into concrete confrontation. What had been simmering tensions now demanded resolution. The armor's symbolic power forced all parties to clarify their positions and commit to courses of action. This chapter examines the period of intensified conflict that followed Kelly's dramatic gesture, exploring how competing visions of society collided and what this collision revealed about power, principle, and the possibilities for change in frontier America. The conflict between Kelly and established authority was never simply personal. It represented broader struggles over fundamental questions that defined the era. Who had legitimate voice in determining how communities should be governed? What obligations did officials owe to those they governed? When did institutional arrangements become so unjust that resistance became not just permissible but necessary? These questions animated political debates across post-Civil War America, and Kelly's situation provided a concrete case where abstract principles met practical reality. Kelly's campaigns for marginalized communities intensified following his public appearance in armor. The armor had made him a more visible and influential figure, someone whose words and actions carried weight beyond what they had previously. He used this enhanced platform to amplify voices that had been systematically excluded from official consideration. Kelly organized meetings where people could share their experiences, document patterns of unfair treatment, and develop collective strategies for demanding reform. These gatherings grew larger and more frequent, as Kelly's symbolic gesture inspired people who had felt powerless to believe that change might be possible. The substance of Kelly's advocacy remained focused on specific, documented grievances rather than vague complaints. He maintained detailed records of instances where regulations were applied inconsistently, where official decisions appeared to favor the well-connected over the deserving, where procedures designed to ensure fairness were bypassed or ignored. This documentation was crucial because it made the case for reform based on evidence rather than mere assertion. Officials could dismiss general complaints as uninformed criticism, but they found it much harder to explain away specific cases where their actions contradicted their stated principles. Kelly also worked to build alliances across different segments of the community. He recognized that officials could more easily isolate and dismiss grievances when they came from groups that could be characterized as having particular axes to grind. However, when diverse constituencies united around common principles of fair treatment and accountable governance, their collective voice became much harder to ignore. Kelly facilitated conversations between immigrant communities and native-born residents, between small farmers and independent merchants, between wage laborers and small business operators. These groups had different specific concerns, but they shared common interest in systems that treated people fairly according to consistent principles rather than according to social connections or official favoritism. Building these coalitions required overcoming significant obstacles. Different groups sometimes harbored suspicions or prejudices toward each other. Economic competition created tensions between people whose interests might otherwise align. Cultural and language differences complicated communication and mutual understanding. Kelly invested considerable effort in helping people see past these divisions to recognize their common stake in just governance. He emphasized that unfair treatment of any group threatened everyone because it established precedents and normalized practices that could eventually be turned against anyone who lacked power or fell out of favor with officials. The moral dimensions of Kelly's advocacy were central to its power. He did not simply argue that current arrangements were inconvenient or economically suboptimal. Instead, he framed the conflict in terms of fundamental principles of human dignity and justice. Kelly insisted that every person deserved respectful treatment, that authority derived legitimacy from serving those governed rather than from position or force alone, and that systems which systematically disadvantaged particular groups violated basic moral principles that should be respected, regardless of law or custom. This moral framing resonated with people's sense of right and wrong in ways that purely pragmatic arguments might not have. Kelly's approach also emphasized nonviolent methods, even as his armor suggested readiness for confrontation. He organized peaceful assemblies, submitted formal petitions through official channels, and sought to work within existing legal frameworks whenever possible. This commitment to peaceful advocacy was both principled and strategic. Principled because Kelly genuinely believed that pursuing just ends through unjust means would undermine the very values he sought to uphold. Strategic because maintaining moral high ground made it more difficult for officials to justify harsh responses, and more likely that neutral observers would sympathize with reform efforts. Officials faced a difficult dilemma in responding to Kelly's intensified advocacy. They could not simply ignore him, as they had dismissed earlier complaints, because his armor and growing following made him too prominent to overlook. Yet taking direct action against Kelly risked making him a martyr, whose treatment would generate broader sympathy for his cause. Officials tried various approaches to managing the challenge Kelly represented. Some attempted to co-opt reform sentiment by announcing modest policy changes that they could present as responsive to community concerns, while avoiding substantive reforms that would threaten existing power arrangements. Others sought to discredit Kelly personally through rumors and insinuations, hoping to separate him from his supporters by making him appear unworthy of trust or motivated by personal ambition rather than principle. These official responses proved largely ineffective because they failed to address the underlying reality that Kelly's advocacy was based on documented patterns of systematic unfairness. Modest policy adjustments did not satisfy people who had experienced years of mistreatment and who recognized that meaningful change required more than superficial modifications. Personal attacks on Kelly's character did not resonate with supporters who knew him through direct experience and who could see that his actions consistently aligned with his stated principles. The gap between official rhetoric about justice and people's lived experiences of injustice had become too wide for officials to bridge through public relations gestures alone. As conventional approaches failed to quiet Kelly's advocacy, some officials began advocating for more forceful responses. They argued that Kelly's continued organizing threatened public order, and that firm action was necessary to demonstrate that challenges to legitimate authority would not be tolerated. This harder line reflected both frustration with Kelly's effectiveness and genuine belief among some officials that any yielding to his demands would encourage further challenges and undermine the stability of governmental institutions. These officials viewed the conflict primarily through the lens of maintaining order and preserving established authority rather than through considerations of justice or responsiveness to legitimate grievances. The escalation of official rhetoric and threats of action created tension within reform movement ranks. Some supporters urged Kelly to moderate his approach, fearing that confrontation would lead to outcomes that would set back rather than advance their cause. Others argued that officials' increasingly hostile responses proved Kelly was right, that only determined resistance would compel change. Kelly had to navigate these internal debates while maintaining focus on core objectives and keeping diverse coalition members united around common purposes, despite their different assessments of tactics and risks. Kelly also faced personal moral dilemmas about how far to press resistance. He recognized that his actions had consequences not just for himself, but for all who supported him. If confrontation led to negative outcomes, his supporters might face retaliation, even if Kelly himself bore the direct costs of his choices. This awareness weighed on Kelly, generating internal conflict between his conviction that justice demanded continued resistance and his sense of responsibility for others' welfare. Historical accounts suggest Kelly spent considerable time in reflection during this period, wrestling with questions about leadership, responsibility, and the ethics of pursuing social change through means that carried risks for others. The support Kelly received from various quarters strengthened his resolve despite these concerns. Many people who had never met Kelly personally sent messages of encouragement, expressing appreciation that someone was finally standing up for principles of justice and dignity that seemed increasingly neglected in frontier society. These expressions of support came from unexpected sources, indicating that Kelly's advocacy resonated beyond his immediate community. The knowledge that his stand inspired others helped Kelly manage doubts about whether the risks of confrontation were justified. The period of intensified conflict also saw important developments in how different social groups understood their own situations. Many people who had previously accepted their circumstances as unfortunate but inevitable began to see systematic patterns in how they were treated. Kelly's analysis helped them understand that their difficulties were not simply bad luck or personal failings, but rather reflected structural arrangements that advantaged some at others' expense. This shift in understanding was psychologically significant because it countered the isolation and self-blame that had made people feel powerless. Recognizing that problems were systematic rather than personal created possibility for collective action that individual responses could never achieve. The clash between Kelly's vision and official authority reached its peak when officials decided they could no longer avoid direct confrontation. The specific circumstances that precipitated this decision remain somewhat unclear in historical records, but it appears that Kelly's organizing had reached a point where officials concluded that further delay in responding would be interpreted as weakness. Officials issued statements characterizing Kelly's activities as threatening to public order and suggesting that action would be taken to ensure that lawful authority was respected. These statements marked a transition from managing Kelly as nuisance to treating him as serious challenge requiring definitive response. Kelly's reaction to these official threats demonstrated his courage and commitment. Rather than backing down or seeking accommodation, he reaffirmed his determination to continue advocating for justice, regardless of personal consequences. He made clear that he would not initiate confrontation, but would also not abandon principles or people simply because officials threatened action. This stance placed responsibility for any confrontation squarely on officials who would have to decide whether enforcing their authority was worth the costs and risks of taking action against someone whose only offense was organizing people to demand fair treatment. The stage was set for decisive confrontation that would determine whether Kelly's resistance would achieve its goals, or whether established authority would successfully suppress challenges to existing arrangements. The community watched and waited, understanding that what happened next would shape not just Kelly's fate, but the broader question of whether ordinary people could effectively challenge institutional power in defense of justice and dignity. The clash between Edward Kelly's vision of justice and established authorities' determination to maintain existing arrangements represented more than local dispute. It embodied fundamental questions about democracy, rights, and the proper relationship between governors and governed that were being contested across America in the 1880s. Kelly's insistence that authority must justify itself through service and accountability challenged assumptions that had long undergirded frontier governance. His success in building broad coalitions around principles of fair treatment demonstrated that marginalized people could find common cause despite differences when united by commitment to justice. The intensification of conflict revealed both the power and limits of symbolic resistance. Kelly's armor had succeeded in forcing attention to issues that officials preferred to ignore, but symbols alone could not compel change if authorities remained determined to resist reform. The question now was whether Kelly's dramatic stand would generate sufficient pressure to overcome official resistance, or whether authorities would succeed in suppressing his challenge as warning to others who might consider similar resistance. Every act of resistance carries consequences, and Edward Kelly's challenge to established authority was no exception. This final chapter examines what happened when the tensions between Kelly's vision of justice and official determination to maintain control reached their inevitable conclusion. More importantly, it explores how Kelly's story continued to resonate long after the immediate confrontation ended, shaping how subsequent generations understood questions of justice, authority, and the responsibilities of citizenship in democratic society. The confrontation between Kelly and official authority unfolded in ways that reflected the fundamental nature of their conflict. Officials sought to demonstrate that challenges to their authority would not succeed, hoping to discourage future resistance by making an example of Kelly. Kelly remained committed to his principles, understanding that backing down would betray not just his own convictions, but the trust of all who had supported his advocacy. The outcome was shaped by choices made by both sides, and by the responses of community members and outside observers who watched events unfold. Historical records indicate that officials eventually moved to take action against Kelly, based on claims that his organizing activities threatened public order. The specific legal justifications cited were technical in nature, involving allegations about permits, assembly regulations, and similar procedural matters. However, everyone understood that these technical charges were pretexts. The real issue was Kelly's effectiveness in challenging official authority and organizing marginalized communities to demand reform. The technical nature of charges allowed officials to claim they were simply enforcing legitimate rules, while avoiding explicit acknowledgement that they were acting to suppress political opposition. Kelly faced difficult decisions about how to respond to official action. His armor symbolized determination to stand firm, but wearing it in direct confrontation with official authority would escalate tensions in ways that might lead to outcomes serving no one's interests. Kelly had to balance his commitment to resistance with responsibility for consequences that his choices might generate for supporters and community. After extensive consultation with advisors and reflection on his principles, Kelly apparently decided to submit to official process while continuing to assert that the actions taken against him were unjust and politically motivated. This decision reflected Kelly's sophisticated understanding of resistance strategy. Direct physical confrontation might have satisfied desires for dramatic gesture, but it would likely have resulted in outcomes that officials could use to discredit broader reform movement. By submitting to official process, while clearly articulating that he was being targeted for political advocacy rather than genuine legal violations, Kelly maintained moral authority while forcing officials to proceed through procedures that would expose the political nature of their actions. This approach required tremendous personal courage because it meant accepting personal consequences while trusting that the justice of his cause would ultimately be recognized. The proceedings against Kelly attracted significant attention, both within his community and beyond. Supporters organized to provide legal assistance and to document what they viewed as misuse of official power to suppress legitimate political advocacy. They gathered in solidarity, making clear through their presence that Kelly represented collective aspirations rather than individual grievances. This demonstration of support was crucial because it prevented officials from isolating Kelly as lone troublemaker, whose fate could be decided without broader implications. The outcomes of official proceedings against Kelly were mixed and contentious. Some charges were sustained based on technical violations that Kelly's defenders argued were selectively enforced against him, while being routinely ignored when committed by those who did not challenge official authority. Other charges were dismissed or resulted in minimal consequences. The overall effect was to impose costs on Kelly for his advocacy without providing the definitive victory that officials had sought. Kelly emerged from the process with his reputation largely intact among supporters, but facing practical constraints on his ability to continue organizing as openly as before. The personal costs Kelly paid for his resistance were substantial. Beyond any formal penalties imposed through official proceedings, he faced ongoing scrutiny and obstacles in his daily life. Business relationships became more difficult as people associated with him faced pressure from officials and their allies. His ability to travel and assemble freely was constrained by threat of additional legal action. The psychological burden of living under constant official attention and knowing that his choices had generated consequences for others weighed heavily on Kelly despite his conviction that his cause was just. Yet Kelly never expressed regret for his resistance. In statements recorded during and after the confrontation, he consistently maintained that standing up for justice and dignity was worth whatever personal costs it entailed. He argued that accepting injustice to avoid confrontation was not really peace but merely postponement of inevitable conflict. Kelly believed that his willingness to accept personal consequences in defense of principles might inspire others to recognize their own capacity for resistance and their own responsibility to stand against injustice rather than passively accepting it. The impact of Kelly's stand extended far beyond immediate outcomes of his confrontation with officials. His example demonstrated to marginalized communities that organized resistance was possible, that ordinary people could challenge institutional power and survive the experience even if they did not achieve complete victory. This demonstration effect was perhaps more important than any specific policy changes that resulted from Kelly's advocacy. People who had felt isolated and powerless gained confidence that collective action could make a difference, even against opponents who seemed overwhelmingly powerful. Kelly's story also influenced how officials approached governance in subsequent years. The confrontation had revealed costs of maintaining unjust arrangements through suppression rather than reform. Officials who witnessed the resources and attention required to manage the challenge Kelly represented became more cautious about creating conditions that might generate similar resistance. While this did not produce immediate transformation of frontier governance, it created incentives for officials to be somewhat more responsive to community concerns and somewhat more careful about the most egregious forms of unfair treatment. The symbolic power of Kelly's armor persisted long after the immediate confrontation ended. The image of an ordinary person crafting protection from scrap materials and standing firm against institutional authority became part of frontier folklore. Stories about Kelly were told and retold, with each retelling emphasizing different aspects depending on the teller's purposes and audience. Some versions emphasized Kelly's courage and determination. Others focused on the injustices that prompted his resistance. Still others drew lessons about the relationship between individual action and collective change. Different communities and constituencies interpreted Kelly's legacy in ways that reflected their own values and circumstances. For some, Kelly represented ideal of principled individual standing against corrupt authority, a narrative that resonated with American traditions of celebrating rebels and iconoclasts. For others, Kelly's story illustrated the importance of community organizing and collective action rather than individual heroism. Some emphasized Kelly's commitment to nonviolent methods, even when facing hostile authority, while others focused on his willingness to prepare for confrontation through his armor. These varied interpretations of Kelly's legacy were not contradictory, but rather reflected the genuine complexity of his story. Kelly was simultaneously principled individual and effective organizer, committed to peaceful advocacy, but prepared to stand firm if necessary, motivated by moral convictions, but also strategically sophisticated in his approach to challenging power. The richness of Kelly's story, allowed different audiences to find in it messages relevant to their own situations and struggles. Scholars and historians who have examined Kelly's story have debated various aspects of its significance. Some emphasize the specific historical context of frontier governance in the 1880s, arguing that Kelly's resistance reflected particular conditions of that time and place that may not be directly applicable to other situations. Others identify broader patterns in Kelly's story that illuminate perennial questions about justice, authority, and resistance that remain relevant across different historical contexts. These scholarly debates have enriched understanding of Kelly's legacy by exploring it from multiple analytical perspectives. One important dimension of Kelly's legacy concerns the question of when resistance to authority becomes justified. Kelly's story provides a case study in how ordinary citizens might think through this difficult question. He did not advocate resistance as first resort, but rather after extended efforts to work through official channels had proven fruitless. He based his resistance on documented patterns of systematic injustice rather than isolated incidents or personal grievances. He remained committed to principles of dignity and justice, even in resistance, avoiding methods that would contradict the values he sought to uphold. These aspects of Kelly's approach offer a model for thinking about justified resistance that balances respect for legitimate authority with recognition that authority can lose legitimacy through sustained patterns of injustice. Kelly's story also speaks to questions about the role of symbolic action in social change efforts. His iron armor was both practical equipment and powerful symbol, and its effectiveness came from combining these dimensions. The armor demonstrated that well-chosen symbols can shift public attention, alter power dynamics, and inspire collective action in ways that conventional advocacy alone might not achieve. However, Kelly's story also illustrates that symbols must be connected to substantive organizing and principled advocacy to generate lasting impact. The armor alone would not have mattered without Kelly's years of community building and documentation of systematic problems. The educational value of Kelly's story has been recognized by teachers and civic educators who use it to help students think about citizenship, justice, and social responsibility. Kelly's experiences raise questions that remain relevant. What obligations do citizens have when they observe injustice? How should people balance respect for authority with recognition that authority can be misused? What methods of resistance are both ethical and effective? How can diverse groups work together, despite differences, to pursue common goals? These questions have no simple answers, but engaging with them through Kelly's concrete story helps develop capacity for moral reasoning and civic engagement. Kelly's legacy also includes his influence on subsequent movements for justice and reform. While direct causal connections are difficult to establish definitively, historians have noted that organizing strategies similar to Kelly's approach appeared in various reform movements in subsequent decades. The emphasis on documenting systematic problems, building coalitions across diverse groups, maintaining commitment to nonviolent methods while refusing to back down from confrontation, and using symbolic actions to generate public attention. These elements of Kelly's approach became common features of successful social change efforts. In the years following his confrontation with officials, Kelly apparently continued his advocacy in less public ways, working within his community to support marginalized people and to promote principles of justice and fair treatment. Historical records from this later period are sparse, but surviving accounts suggest Kelly remained committed to his values while adapting his methods to changed circumstances. His willingness to persist in working for justice even after paying significant personal costs demonstrated that his resistance had been motivated by genuine conviction rather than desire for personal recognition or dramatic gesture. Kelly's death, when it eventually came, was noted in regional newspapers that remembered him as a controversial figure who had challenged authority during turbulent period in frontier history. These obituaries reflected the mixed views Kelly generated during his lifetime. Some remembered him as hero who had stood for justice, while others characterized him as troublemaker who had disturbed social peace. The diversity of these remembrances itself testified to the significance of Kelly's impact. Figures who generate such divergent assessments are clearly people who mattered, whose actions forced others to take positions and examine their own values. In the decades following Kelly's death, his story continued to evolve, as different generations reinterpreted his legacy according to their own concerns and contexts. During periods when challenges to authority were viewed sympathetically, Kelly was remembered as principled rebel. During periods emphasizing order and stability, his story was told more critically. These shifting interpretations demonstrate how historical figures become vehicles through which societies debate contemporary questions, with the past serving as resource for thinking about present challenges. Edward Kelly's journey from ordinary frontier citizen to legendary symbol of resistance illustrates timeless truths about justice, courage, and the capacity of ordinary people to challenge institutional power in defense of their dignity. His iron armor, fashioned from scrap materials through individual labor, became an enduring symbol of the determination required to stand against systematic injustice. His willingness to accept personal consequences rather than abandon principles demonstrated that moral courage can persist even when practical outcomes remain uncertain. Kelly's legacy reminds us that social change requires both principled individuals willing to take risks and organized communities ready to support those individuals. His story illustrates that resistance can take many forms, from documentation and advocacy to symbolic gestures and coalition building, and that effective resistance often requires combining these approaches strategically. Most importantly, Kelly's life teaches that the struggle for justice is never finally won, but requires ongoing commitment from each generation to defend and extend the principles of dignity and fairness that make democratic society possible. The Iron Man's story continues to resonate because the questions it raises remain relevant wherever people confront tensions between authority and justice, between order and fairness, between accepting circumstances and working to change them. Edward Kelly's armor may have been crafted from the iron of 1880, but the courage and conviction it symbolized remain as necessary today as they were then.